y empezamos la siguiente conferencia de nuestra jornada. Tengo el honor de presentar al siguiente ponente, que es Professor Craig Stephen Titus. En castellano se escribe Titus, el apellido, por si queréis buscar en internet, quien es teólogo, filósofo y profesor de IPS de Virginia. Viene desde Estados Unidos para hacernos esta presentación. En el caso de que hubiera preguntas, podéis ir apuntándolas y al final habrá un turno de preguntas. Professor Titus, we have a pleasure to receive you in our university, and you have time for your lecture right now.
Thank you very much. Everyone see me now with my jacket on? I'm going to take it off. It's not on. How's that? Is that better? Not strong enough? I think he's going to get it. So this is not your first certificate exam today. That was the first test, if you understand English. You passed. But I will speak in English, since that is my habit, and we will be speaking in habitus in various ways. And so I will speak a bit slower than I do normally, but I don't expect that it will be necessarily clear, because you all study British English here, and so you have to forgive me that I don't speak the Queen's English. What I'd like to do today is to talk about the role of prudence in character formation. And what I have in front of you is this lovely image that you'll only make out parts of because of the distance that you're seated from it. But what it is a 14th century illustration of the tree of virtues. At present, in the world of psychology, there's a new movement that's afoot, which is called positive psychology. In various ways, it is looking to use the virtues as a way of looking at the positive end, the finality of human life. And that positive end, which in various ways moves us throughout our lives, is extremely important. Psychology could only deny it for so long. The medical model that looked to what was wrong with the person, which many psychologists and early modern psychologists use, had to give way to some kind of positive movement that looks to what is final in life. And the positive psychology movement tries to look towards what is positive. But just elements of what is positive is not enough. And in various ways, Seligman and Peterson, the high priests of the positive psychology movement, do look to particular virtues. What they don't yet see, and I think it's a matter of time because honest empirical psychologists tend to discover more and more the richness of life. What they don't see yet is the type of integration that is found in such an image. It's a symbol, but what it does is it shows us in an organic form what's happening within every human person. You'll notice that there are 7 types of centerings, center points, from which there shoots forth different bulbs. And so there's the ones that have red in them and are numbered represent the key virtues that, structurally speaking, reflect certain key points within the human person that can't be denied. And at the very bottom, if you will, the first one on the left-hand side, which is numbered number 1, is prudence. And it's the virtue of prudence which we are talking about today in the day-long conference. I understand that some of you might not have been here this morning. Was anyone here this morning? Okay, so some of you were here. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at prudence, but I'm going to, with the idea of talking about moral character formation, also tip my hat, point towards the other virtues that are here present, and those are the moral virtues, and you'll see them there in terms of justice, fortitude, and temperance. And we're going to talk a little bit about them later on. My main point here is that they're connected. And the connections will become clear, I hope, with time. would just also hint that at the top, and this is a classical vision, a classical Christian vision, is that charity, faith, and hope also serve as key elements within an understanding of the wholeness of the person. Now, in one sense, maybe just another commentary on positive psychology has tipped its hat at the theological. It's tipped its hat at the philosophical. And what it's done is it said, we as psychologists can recognize that, but it's not our business. And I think at one level, that's what our business is here today, to be bolder than positive psychology has been to date, to see how there can be and how there is a need to address the fullness of prudence, reason, and the way that the human person can draw itself together or be drawn together, including the spiritual element. Now, the spiritual element, sometimes we wonder whether this is scientific or not. But what we're going to do, and as an American, you can tell from my accent, I'm American, even though I have a Swiss passport as well. Talking of this, the spiritual is not forbidden. And so, in Europe, sometimes it's more complex, even in a Catholic country. And so today, I will, in passing, speak of the spiritual as well. What I have is a text of 40 pages. So I want you to all, I would tell you to buckle your seatbelt, but fortunately this morning, much of what I was said, about 38 pages of what I said, was already said. So I just have 2 pages to complete. You're passing the test, very good. So what I'd like to do is, nonetheless, I'll talk about prudence in a nutshell, right practical reason. And I will talk about the reasonableness and unreasonableness of acts in general. I'd like to set the discussion then in this context, the psychosocial context, that identifies a classical approach to understanding 3 key steps in the work of practical reason. Then I'd like to talk in passing about the virtue of right practical reason per se, and then talk about cognitive strengths and weaknesses. And once again, I'm going to tip my hat. I'm going to point in the direction of what has been said before. First of all, Aristotle, since this was not said before, the quote up on top of the screen reads, "It is thought that a young man of practical wisdom cannot be found." Aristotle's point here is that even though as young people, and I have children, I have one son who's very good at math. Children of young ages can be very good at math. But in terms of practical, right practical reason about everyday life and things that are more complicated than math, it takes experience. Aristotle saw it, we see it. The more the empirical scientists turn towards it, the more interesting this type of quote is. Aquinas's I'm going to make reference to Aristotle. I'm going to make references to Aquinas, and you'll see hopefully at the end, if you haven't already been convinced, that there's something interesting here to attend to. Aquinas' virtue perspective helps us to understand the virtue of prudence as a cognitive strength that is, if you will, intellectual at 3 levels. And the specificity of the virtue of prudence will become clear as I move along, but it will involve the 3 steps of discerning or counsel, taking discernment or counsel, making judgments about the means that one needs to get to the ends that you've discerned or counseled about, and then actually commanding yourself into movement. Why is this significant? Well, as was mentioned this morning, in many ways, we can know what we're supposed to do. We can discern and even be told, be counseled, what would be good for us. We can even determine the right means, and judge about right means towards those ends, but we don't do them. Why is that? This is one of the great mysteries of the human person and of human societies, that we know what will bring us health, we know what will, in one way, bring us something of happiness, but we don't do it. Theory does not lead directly to practice, and theory does not directly lead to flourishing. When I say flourishing, I mean happiness, I mean blessedness, beatitude, depending on what level we're talking about. But also, the virtue of prudence, introducing, it helps to connect the moral virtues in forming one's character. Now this morning, Dr. Echeverria did point out, if you will, the context for my discussion, because in addition to the practical side of prudence that I'll be exploring, and the applied side, he identified, if you will, the intellectual side of wisdom, sometimes called wisdom, sapiencia, or intellectual, or if you will, theoretical or speculative prudence. I'm going to be focusing more on the applied aspect, and that's another side of prudence called either right practical reason, prudentia, phronesis in Greek, and it's in that context that I'll be tipping my hat to what was said already by Dr. Echeverria this morning, but also counting on how this discussion of how important prudence is and the way that it forms these moral virtues, these other parts of the tree that I mentioned, and that all in terms of forming one's character. This morning we had another talk by Dr. Aquilino Palino, and one of the things that he pointed out to us is that what we do influences who we are. What we do influences what we are. And so the acts that we do actually make concerning our life of virtue, the way that we're courageous in front of difficulties, hopeful in front of problems, patient in front of suffering, influences who we are, what we become. And that is all quite significant if we're interested in a perspective of flourishing. Not just getting people out of difficulties, making them suffer less, but making significant contributions to them flourishing globally, and if you will, wholly. In one sense, we can put prudence in a nutshell by looking to it as a cognitive virtue that requires effective and collaborative input in virtues and personal, family, and socio-political ends. Now hold on, you're saying to yourself. I thought it was going to be a bit more simple. You were talking about counsel, judgment, and command. But as Dr. Palette described this morning, our lives are not so simple. And prudence is not such a simply individual type of virtue. It involves our affective and cognitive capacities, but in the context that we never find ourselves out of. We always find ourselves in the context of the family, of social-political ends in various ways. Our purposes in life are not just about ourselves. That's a very deep type of narcissism, if you have someone who's locked into simple concern about themselves. In various ways, developmentally, we can see how that does happen. We grow out of it, though, normally. There are the moments when the child doesn't yet understand explicitly his relationship, her relationship to others. And there is a type of, if you will, first concern with oneself or connection with others, but there's no distinguishing clarity about who we are. But if we look deeply, we understand, and I think if we look deeply in who the person is, we're going to understand that they're connected with other people. This is a part of the tradition. Aristotle himself thought that held that humans were social beings. And so in various ways, positive psychology or any kind of psychology that would look to virtues in individualistic ways, they weren't conceived in those parameters. We're going to come back to that. What I'd like to do now is in one sense go very quickly over a structural analysis. Okay, we're that big tree of virtue. We're focusing on prudence for the moment, But within Aquinas' understanding of prudence, he has three types of prudence that we can't understand prudence without looking at them. And those are called the integral, subjective, and potential parts. Strange type of language. Let me try to explain to you. First of all, and here my work has been made simple also by Dr. Palet's very savant approach to the integral parts. She did mention a number of them that Pieper had identified. Aquinas' list is longer, and we could spend a couple days talking about prudence according to its integral parts. Integral parts themselves mean that in order for us to understand the fullness of right practical reason, moving from the speculative to the practical, moving into the actual doing, we need to consider these aspects of human action: memory, understanding, docility, acumen, reason, judgment, foresight, circumspection, and caution. I'm going to come back to those later to talk about a couple of others, but already this morning, just a reminder for those who are here, Dr. Palet talked about memory with very great insight. I'm passing quickly over the integral parts in one sense, because perhaps we pay too much attention to them outside of the context of the other parts. What do you mean, you say? Subjective parts involve the kinds of prudence, which means there are different types of right practical reasoning. Now you say to me, now in a court of law, most often it's going to be you and me, head to head, the law against an individual who's responsible for his or her acts, the law against the person. And it's true that we have a special, and we need to be very conscious of individual responsibility. But personal prudence and personal individual responsibility is not the whole picture. In various ways, we are prudent we come to decisions that are rational and practical through our participation in political associations and in the city-state, in the contemporary nation, in our regional government, in our local associations. There's political prudence. But also, and this is something that Dr. Palet also was referring to this morning, is really family or domestic prudence. In order for us to understand how I make decisions on a regular basis and long term, in many ways you have to understand Giovanna, my wife, and you have to understand Luca and Matteo, my children. Because I do things, including yesterday, I took the arm of one cadena and twisted him behind his back to take me to Sagrada Familia. We didn't have much time, but I couldn't come home without my son saying, "Did you go and take pictures of Antonio Gaudi's Sagrada Familia?" So yesterday, that was an empirical experiment. My son set me going. It didn't get finished until he took me there. And it's an example in various ways how we do things because, and we make practical decisions because of who we are in relationship to others. And certainly, the family, from the very beginning of our existence, has been, in normal circumstances, that place where we learn to know where to go, to have some kind of inkling of flourishing. Our life is about flourishing, and it's about, in various ways, seeking ends that are worthy of the human person. And domestic prudence is much understudied. Military prudence, another reality, that if you're good, for example, in personal prudence, and perhaps you're very good at family prudence, it's not going to necessarily mean you're going to make a great general. Military prudence, by the nature of the object of military efforts, involves a special type of science, a special type of skill, as all of these do. Not just personal prudence, but also according to the end. John F. Kennedy, I know that you take British English, but John F. Kennedy, has anyone heard of John F. Kennedy? American president who was assassinated. In various ways, Kennedy, like Martin Luther King, were very astute politically, perhaps personally, in their personal lives, had major areas that they were missing. And so it's interesting to look at and understand right practical reason. It's interesting, we have to understand the finality, the context. And when we look to the person concerning their decisions, we'll be short-sighted if we don't put them in context. And that's why also, coming back just in terms of the spiritual dimension, if a person really is in any way anchored in a personal or aesthetic or a relational or personal relationship, then we have to in some ways attend to those realities in order to understand what makes them move, what makes them act, what makes them make judgments. Now very quickly the potential parts. So we have the integral parts, the parts in one sense that make up particular actions, the types of prudence that help us to understand the context of the end that someone is searching, in terms of their person, their family, their society. And then also there's the potential parts that Aquinas talks about in terms of being various ways that prudence is completed. So prudence in that tree of virtues that was up at the beginning, identify different balls, and those balls are virtues that serve prudence. And in many ways, we can and need to develop prudence, not just in, if you will, discerning, but also taking counsel. Now, taking counsel is not just counseling myself, it's taking counsel from other people. And so in various ways, Aquinas identified within his context also that we needed to develop special virtues for taking counsel. How many times have we been about ready to do something when a friend says something? Sometimes our memory recalls a friend saying something, but a friend can say something also, or parents or a spouse, and you turn around and you realize that the context is different. The counsel has changed my view. I now have a more accurate perspective on reality, and I then proceed practically to move into an action based on the counsel that I received, that I took. It takes a special humility, and Aquinas identifies that taking counsel as one of the allied virtues or potential parts of prudence, right practical reason. But also there's two other seemingly curious, perhaps, potential parts. And the first one is called, the first I have here, number 2, is called, if you will, maybe translated, judging according to common rules of action. In many ways, what we do in our lives are dictated by custom. We have customs about how we drive in the street, on which side of the street we drive on. And normally we follow customs, and we have in various ways to learn how to make proper judgments based upon the context that we live in. Our family customs, the neighborhood customs, in this case the institutional, the university customs, and in the case of being Catalan, certain customs, Spanish certain customs, European certain customs. I want to say that some people are better at being, if you will, a part of the family, a part of the neighborhood. And Aquinas recognizes that that's a practical part of our coming to flourishing, that we do gain the sense of how best to judge and help other people, in this case, come to flourishing according to the common rules of action that we have within our families, within our societies. But there are those situations when customs fail. What do I mean? We can't just live by customs when those customs in various ways go against significant values that in principle that they should defend. What we have is in the example of a very great American philosopher of virtue, Alistair McIntyre, who has done much reflection on the significance of the virtues according to a Thomistic approach. We have a Thomist or philosopher in Alistair MacIntyre. And it's very interesting, I think that he is very good at helping us to understand this last point, that in certain cases, the practices that generate activities in our families or societies fail to protect the ends, the good of the individual. What do I mean? In certain cases, and we can think about it in terms of unjust wars, there has been certain types of conscientious objection that is necessary. What is conscientious objection? If the state, if the family, if your friends do something that is destructive, how do you make appeal to that? If it's just my vote or majority vote, then there's no appeal possible, the majority rule. But if there is, some kind of right beyond that, above that, some kind of source of right that founds the rightness of custom and the rightness of civil law, then we have to be able to access that. And that is what the tradition calls natural law. Natural law and the judgments based on natural law are, if you will, at the heart of our understanding what is right and good and just. This morning we talked a lot about goodness and truth, as if you will, being the operative direction that prudence takes us in. And what we have in a very deep understanding of our desire for goodness and our desire for truth is that a deep desire for goodness and truth are tied together with also our desire for the family, with our desire for society, and underlying all of that, a desire for what is ultimate. Now, for anyone who's, so for the Thomists in the crowd, that is, in one sense, the basis that Aquinas understands and the tradition understands for natural law. That we all have natural inclinations towards goodness and truth. And those natural inclinations can't be understood one without the other. And goodness and truth and our inclinations towards them can't be understood unless we understand also our inclinations to family and society. Natural law only holds together when all of those are understood together. I have a graph chart I'll show you later on. When they're all held together, also within the context of how we have a basic desire for the ultimate. You see it in various ways. I work with, as was mentioned, I work with the Institute for Psychological Sciences, and the clinicians that I work with, the clinical psychologists, continue to see that in various ways, in terms of different types of pathology, there's these inclinations for goodness and truth, personal well-being, society and family, that get twisted into knots. And part of therapy is untying that. And part of a judgment of prudence that's very critical is to recognize when what seems natural within us is really a counter-natural type of tying of knots. Come back to it. Just a little flash here. In terms of that this description of Aquinas' understanding of prudence, we have to say also that he has a very interesting notion that involves also a place for counsel, not just coming from ourselves or others, but also coming from a source beyond us. He calls that the gifts of the Holy Spirit, one of them being counsel. And he recognizes that in various ways we're drawn towards a spiritual good, and that the Spirit in its gifts can also represent itself, not just in understanding and wisdom and knowledge, but counsel, as well as fortitude and piety and fear of the Lord, respect for the Lord. Aquinas' vision is philosophical and theological, and also it is extremely nuanced psychologically, without it being empirical psychology, and without it being, if you will, as advanced in terms of our understanding of developmental psychology. But also he understands, and this is another point that I'll just make and come back to later, is that he understands how in various ways there are knots tied, things can go wrong, that the habits we form can also be formed into vices, and there can be, if you will, habits of imprudence, negligence, and false or sham prudence. And that in various ways there are protections against that found within the commandments and various precepts. Now the three phases that I mentioned are the three phases of deliberation, taking counsel, right judgment and conscience, command, self-direction, and practical action. I want to go through those. Deliberation and taking counsel. According to right practical reason, when we put into context our efforts to deliberate and to take counsel, there really is, if you will, a whole person that's active. I put up here two moments within that action. One is cognitive and one is volitional. But we should add here to that also the emotional and the social. And to really kind of flesh it out for each of these, I would have those four elements of cognitive, volitional, emotional, and social. But here, just to focus for a moment in, a deliberation involves the types of viable ends, finalities, activities or relationships that make a difference for flourishing, that bring some kind of happiness to us. And those set within a larger, if you will, draw towards the good and towards the true. But our reason, the cognitive aspects, our cognitive capacities, our intellectual capacities, don't function by themselves. And that's what we saw this morning, that they're extremely complex. And the complexity comes forth also in the way that there has to be some kind of consent. We don't move forward in deliberating and taking counsel unless we deliberate and consent to one of the good goals that are identifiable. Give me an example. You say, I want to visit my mother. What do I do? Is that good? So first of all, I have to determine that that's good, or it's possible. Is it good? Yes. Is it possible? Perhaps not. But if I determine that it is possible, I can have an intention to do it. And then I need to, if you will, deliberate and take counsel. What's the best way? I talk to my wife. Do I take the plane? Do I take the car? Do I take the boat? Actually, she happens to live in America. And then I have to judge on that. And it's in that it's in the right practical reason in the middle where there's a practical judgment about the means. I say, okay, I will take the car. Maybe I'll use that one simply because that's probably more approximate to your experience. I say, the car is better, it costs less, and it's possible. And then I choose it. But just in intellectually choosing to go and visit my mother by car is not enough. It's those speculative things that we do in life that don't do us a hill of beans. They don't get us where we're going, and they don't mean anything until we go to the next point. We command ourselves, okay, get your keys, and let's pack the bag, and let's start moving. And so one has to decide to actually do it, and then one has to take the keys and put them in and turn the key. There's the goal, there are the means, and there's the actual action. One of the interesting things about right practical reason, prudence, is that it helps us to understand the complexity of that. But also, there's another level of complexity, another triplet, another set of three. When we talk about prudence as a virtue, often we can get confused, because a virtue can mean three things. It can mean a disposition or a habitus to act. It can mean the norm or the reason, the intelligibility within the act. Or it can mean the act itself. And quite often, that I've found, there are confusions about virtue theory when there's not this distinction. And I know that Dr. Chevalier in your classes talk a lot about these distinctions.
and this morning I saw that in your presentation. Let me nonetheless talk a little bit in this context because I think it's significant. If we're talking about right practical reasoning, we can talk about right practical reasoning in acts, and in various ways, the various movements, and I talked about the parts of an act in that analysis, the three main central aspects of prudence. And so we'll see, it involves rational acts, but at the same time, letter A, it involves dispositions to act. As Dr. Paulino talked about this morning, in many ways we become what we do. What we do influences who we are, and disposition, or habitus, is this very rich notion of how in various ways we have tendencies to do something, natural inclinations, but our acts then set those inclinations further into specificity. The way I greet my mother and show her that I love her, I have a disposition towards my wife, a disposition different than my mother. And if we confuse those in marriage, you're going to get in trouble very quickly. If you treat your mother, or you tend to treat your mother like your wife, or your wife like your mother, or someone else's wife like your wife. If we have those types of tendencies, that's very problematic. Particular acts are problematic enough. Right? Let's talk about infidelity for a minute. An act of infidelity that's completely out of character, that's done while drunk, is different than an act of infidelity that's an endpoint in a series of infidelities where one has a disposition towards it. And so, it's very significant when you're thinking about your own lives, or psychotherapeutically also, when someone is tending towards a particular act, or there's almost an accidental or mistaken or erroneous act that would fall into that category. But how do we, this is the third point, identify what is really a virtue, be it courage, patience, perseverance, fortitude, or practical reasoning? There's always some kind of intelligibility, finality. I'm calling it here a knowle. If there is, and in one sense, prudence is the way through which we understand how the norm is communicated in the other virtues. I'm talking about character formation. To build character involves the way that these various virtues relate to each other. And all of those, in one sense, come into not just being similar in having a disposition, relating to a disposition of a power within the person towards an end, nor being acts that are good towards that end, but also taken up in reason. And so the various ways that virtues, for example, courage, involves a participation in a higher good, the good of doing what is right in the face of danger. That involves a judgment. We have to make judgments. And in various ways, prudence is that judgment, the way that all of our lives start to participate in reasons, finalities, purposes, and those taken up within an understanding of goodness and truth. This morning, conscience was also discussed, and I would just maybe make one point as a supplement, technically. Because Dr. Paulette was very thorough about talking about the formation of conscience. And here, in terms of one other point, I just wanted to say that, for example, St. Jerome makes first of all, when we think about conscience, if you had some catechism, what does it say to you? It's the little voice that speaks to you, right? It's the angelic voice versus the demonic voice. And that's what we think of. Jerome's and Aquinas' view is that there's something deep within us, God's voice within us, and that's the natural source, not just of natural law, but also of God's very presence to us, that is a spark that's always there. And so there's, according to the tradition's understanding, there's always this spark of natural law, God's presence in creation, and also his presence within redemption that is there. But what happens is that there's also this way that we can hide that. And so in various ways, conscience can be erroneous, because the judgments that we make, or that the context that we've lived in, have in some sense shaded our view towards the deeper truth about where we're going, or where we're called to go. And so I just wanted to make that little distinction there, that we understand the human person has a dignity that is true to themselves. Each person is created as with purpose. And their conscience sometimes is marked, and they don't always have the right, an effective judgment of conscience because of perhaps the way that they've because of the way that they've been taught. But nonetheless, there's a spark that underlies our searching for what is good, our being, as St. Augustine says, always thirsting until God, always being restless. That restless part that directs us towards God can be understood to be a spark of conscience. Just in terms of wrapping this up, because the time is running short, and I've covered the 39 pages, 38 that they've already covered this morning, and the one that I've now just covered. There's one more page to go. I wanted just to say that in terms of talking about the growth and failure in right practical reasoning, there's always going to be, for a full understanding of this very rich Thomistic tradition, a need to attend to the latest empirical studies and development. Aquinas, and if you will, the philosophical tradition that he represents, always looks, if you will, not just to tradition. Aquinas looked to the scriptural tradition, he looked to the philosophical tradition, but also he looked at what was going on. And so, an up-to-date, and this is what my institute is doing, is an up-to-date look at the virtues at present, can be not only drawing on a tradition of wisdom, but also on the best of the sciences at present, which involves then criteria and judgments about what is appropriate and what is not. What's the criteria? The criteria is the person. The person at the center of the stage. John Paul II called the person to the forefront, but from the tradition also, the person is always to be studied through the developmental studies, but also clinical studies that help us to understand something about what goes right in just types of right practical reason and what goes wrong in various types of imprudence, including also certain types of uncertainty and errors and distractions, and how they can, in various ways, inhibit us from making right practical decisions based upon the biophysiological issues and incapacities, or the lack of practice, or various types of psychosocial or spiritual pathologies. Those areas that the integral parts also need to be understood in how they go wrong. And so memory can not only be used for good, but also can be used for egotistical and evil ends. Intelligence can be used to rationalize one's pursuits of partial truths instead of ultimate truths. Lessons from others, human, can be used for wrong-headed solutions. Quick judgments, foresight, circumspection can discern justice and the common good when turned around. And caution, which can be very helpful for prudence and right practical reason, can also be turned against. We be careful not to do certain things that would undercut our own power or selfish pleasures. And so, I just want to show you this slide before I conclude, because the time is upon us. Remember I was talking about the natural law and the inclinations that in one sense underlie our virtues and our vices. We have at the very center of the circle a basic inclination to flourish, this ultimate end that we have, to be happy. Martin Seligman recently has corrected his vision of happiness in his book called Flourish. Before he was talking about happiness, and now he's talking about flourishing, and he's expanded it in various ways, and I think in interesting ways. The tradition identifies that inclination to flourish as being rooted within this desire for the good, desire to be, to exist, the desire for truth, the desire for family life, and social acts. This is the basis of the natural law, the Summas Prima Secundae 94.2, and it helps us only if we realize that we can't understand truth unless it's linked to goodness, and goodness unless it's linked to family and society. And all these have to fit together, even though in various ways there's a hierarchy within them. One example is that the desire, as all creatures, sentient creatures, to preserve one's own life can be actually set aside for hierarchy. One example. In conclusion, right practical reason, I'm going to read this part and show you what you missed. I'll be reading the 40 pages. Right practical reason employs philosophical virtues and psychological strengths. This talk has illustrated that a developmental view of the virtue of prudence, right practical reason, in action, bridges part of the gap between human nature's origin and finality. In terms of prudence as disposition to act, as norm, and as practice, the twin sources of intelligence, origin and flourishing, provide a context for discussing the formal, developmental human skills and related therapeutic efforts. In prudential action and therapy, we do not simply seek what is normatively permitted and avoid what is forbidden. In personal and interpersonal relations, including that with God, we employ reason and affections to address actively and contemplate lovingly truth, goodness, unity, and beauty. Therein, we participate in the ultimate source of intelligibility and flourishing. Acts of imprudence produce the contrary. They compound problems such as depression, addiction, and marital discord, engendering practical creativity and normative uprightness in reasonable action throughout life, including the support of psychotherapy and in building a character, and forming character, which all require a connecting 4 levels of philosophical virtue, psychological strength, and everyday practice. Connecting the virtues, the tree of life showed us the connection of virtues. And in various ways, it's not those virtues, not simply those virtues as shown, prudence and justice and fortitude and temperance, faith, hope, and love, but it's also the dimensions of those virtues. And those dimensions involve the volition. Volitional means motivation, it means love. And the volitional that addresses the ordering of love and faces distractions from the environment, first of all, volitional. Secondly, the emotional that manages the affective attractions and repulsions. Our life of emotions has to be considered in looking at the whole of virtue and the connection of virtues. Third, the social that deals with beneficial and nefarious influences of family, peers, and culture. And fourthly, the point that we're talking about today, the rational, which can't be understood outside of the context of the volitional, emotional, and social. That is, the rational that faces cognitive complexity and adjudicates or judges between competing versions or competing visions of truth and goodness. So in conclusion, at personal, social, and spiritual levels, people employ these resources to perform reasonable acts that are both creative and faithful to truth, and to form characters that participate in the good of reason, both human and divine. Now I know we all started a little bit late, but maybe there's time for a question or two.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Titus, por su brillante exposición, la capacidad de síntesis extraordinaria, y gracias a su perfecto time control tenemos tiempo para alguna pregunta, por si hubiera de la sala. Si alguien se siente más cómodo haciéndola en castellano, yo me ofrezco a intentar traducirla. Pues si quiere hacerlo directamente en inglés, perfecto. Then I'll make a question if you allow me. You've been speaking about different kinds of prudence, including military prudence, for example. But what about the education? Would there be any special kind of prudence in the field of education? ¿Se ha entendido, no?
Sit there. So is there an educational prudence? I would think that there definitely is, and we don't realize it perhaps. Or we do, but we don't perhaps look more too as carefully at the type of criteria that can help us in discerning prudentially in terms of educational institutes. Why? For an educational institute to function, there has to be a culture of seeking truth. And what is your devise? I think I saw it someplace. What is it? It's a way of wisdom, seeking the way of wisdom. I will show you the way of wisdom. And I imagine that's a reference to the source of all wisdom. And if an educational institute chooses such a devise, a logo, it is to seek out the truth. But in a contemporary culture, there are different ways of seeking truth. And so, if there is, and I think there is, a prudential way of building up a culture of education, there has to be, in one sense, a continual type of recognition that there are right ways and wrong ways of educating. And there are right ends and short-sighted ends about bringing the human person to flourishing. And I think because of the nature, the pragmatic, the practical level of education, it's always going to be something where we're learning. There are cultures, there are practices that come down from culture, and there's other things we learn in educational science and empirical research. And I think by the nature, this is the nature also of practical wisdom, that it's not at the level of the speculative wisdom, where you can have a certain necessity of conclusion. You're going to have to come down to a pragmatic or practical level, which is still seeking truth, but at the same time is recognizing that there is this movement forward that needs to be humble, and that humility of purpose in moving forward in an education involves all the virtues. In one sense, this is a perfect example. The question is there a culture, is there a prudence of education? And if we say yes, I think we can, we have to recognize that in order for it to advance and continue to advance towards serving the person and serving the persons who are here, then it has to have courage and it has to have temperance. Not just at the level of individuals within the system. For it to function well, the rectors and deans and professors and all the students have to be seeking a virtuous life together, seeking to flourish in the good. But not just individually. There has to be a culture that is courageous, and a culture that is temperate, and a culture that is right reasoned. So the connecting of all those virtues in that tree concerning the tree of this institute or other educational institutes will involve an ongoing process because the individuals change, but also because the institute itself has to continue to grow in terms of new challenges
new data about how we learn, new data also about how we fail. So I did end on time because I do live in Switzerland now, so there are always Swiss watches.
Thank you very much. A round of applause again.